From Washington to Warsaw, Paris to Ankara, Brussels, Berlin, Bucharest, and Belgrade. Through pandemics and political movements, cooperation and confrontation, digital divides, and defending democracy, the German Marshall Fund is at the pulse of transatlantic relations today, convening the experts and insights needed to navigate tomorrow's world.
Good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. I'm Ian Lesser at GMF here in Brussels, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our online discussion today, our conversation around NATO 2030, United for a New Era. The title is drawn from a report of the Reflection Group, which has released its report for the NATO Secretary General in this past December. And we're very fortunate to have with us today three people who were really at the heart of this exercise, the two co-chairs of the exercise, and also Marta Dassù, but Thomas de Maizière, a member of the German Bundestag, Wess Mitchell, now principal of the Marathon Initiative, and Marta Dassù, as I mentioned, Senior Director for European Affairs at the Aspen Institute in Rome. All friends of GMF, we're really delighted that you could join us today. They all obviously, of course, have had very distinguished careers in public service as well. But here today, we're going to talk about the Reflection Group, the experience of it, some of its conclusions, but also, above all, what it might tell us about the future as NATO looks towards its next summit, likely in June, but also the launch of a new strategic concept exercise. And so we're planning on having no speeches today, just a conversation among our speakers. And then we're going to save some time at the end to open it up to all of you for questions. And you can do that actually on Zoom through the Q&A function. And I will keep track of those and I'll try to get to as many as I can. We have a large group with us today. So let's see how we do. But maybe I could start off this way by asking you, Thomas, to talk a little bit about to reflect a little bit on the Reflection Group experience, some of the key themes that came out, but also maybe if you wanted to say a word about the kind of messages you took away in terms of how an exercise like this can work and what was most useful about it, but maybe what was difficult about it. Very briefly, Thomas, over to you. Thanks again for being with us.
Yes, well, dear Ian and Marta and Wess and the whole group, welcome to this meeting. Well, this exercise, as you call it, was unique because we didn't see each other. we all worked via these VTCs, different platforms. So we had a lot of meetings, a lot of consultations, and then a drafting period. And it was close to a miracle that although we never met, a close relation grew up between us, not only between Wess and me. This was really a new miracle for me, but for the whole group. And if you see the group was very well designed by Jens Stoltenberg. 5 men, 5 women from all perspectives of NATO. Some were interested in the South, others on Russia, others on China, others on NATO-European relations, and so on and so forth. And we are proud that we did it to make a consensus report. No minority votes or so. We tried to do it short. Our goal was not more than 50 pages, like Madame Albright did. We failed, but let's say less than 70 pages is good enough. We try to do it that you can read it. It's the language. We put a lot of effort in it. So I think this was remarkable. The echo was great, from not only from foreign ministers. Wess and me had the privilege to present it there, but from the Russian foreign ministry, from the Chinese foreign ministry. So this was interesting. And of course, from a lot of experts. And the echo was too many recommendations, not many recommendations on this or that point, too general, too specific. So that's normal. In the end, I think the echo was more or less good, and the first reaction from Jens Stoltenberg was even better. So, but for us, it's important that this is not a think tank report. This is not a food for thought paper. It's a recommendation for actions. This is very practical actions, important ones, smaller ones, and this was important for us. One of our main recommendations that NATO should start a short process for an updated strategy. I think this is now common sense. That's good. What we recommend, we will come to that later on, is a new political culture for debates. NATO should be, again, the forum for debates and should not avoid debates because they are afraid that this could decrease cohesion. So a lot of recommendations there. We are, in a way, part of the process, not formal, but informal. And the last thought I would like to make is the elections, the American elections, did not play a role because we are focusing on NATO 2030. Then we definitely will have a new president. And there are some, of course, there is another wording, another tone from the American side towards Europe, but in substance, on China, on Russia, and on burden sharing, it's quite similar. So what we suggest, or as a personal opinion, we should take this process of adaptation, the process of a new strategy, in the same time for a new start for a transatlantic deal. This could be good not only for the German Marshall Fund, but for our relations as well. I stop here so we have more time for discussion.
Thomas, thank you very much indeed for starting us off. Wess, maybe I could come to you now and share some of your reflections on this, but also maybe pick up on something that Thomas mentioned, which was, very much part of the debate around the Reflection Initiative, which was, the notion of a more political NATO in some sense, which was read in different ways in different places. Anyway, share some thoughts with us about the process and about the exercise as a whole. Go ahead, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ian, for hosting us, and congrats on the great work that GMF is doing there in Brussels. And I'll just reciprocate the very warm words from Thomas and extend my greetings to Marta as well. I really enjoyed working with both of these fine people. And I will just underscore something Thomas said, which is I think the deportment of our group really did, show there's a lot of glue and commonality in the approaches of countries on both sides of the Atlantic to the big problems in the relationship today. And I think that's an important point to stress up front, not just for stylistic reasons, but there is a kind of thesis about Europe and the United States today that we're on divergent strategic paths. And we can talk more about in the Q&A. I think in some regards we are. But one big takeaway from the outcomes of the NATO Reflection Group is that if a group of 10 experts from countries with different political positioning and in some ways interests can reach agreement on the really big main and plain priorities, and I think our report does do a good job on saying what those priorities are, that gives me a lot of confidence for what is politically possible. I might just underscore a couple of points that, or rather expand on points that came out of what Thomas has said. The first one, I can't stress this enough, is we were given a very specific task by Stoltenberg, and it was a different kind of task than Madeleine Albright was given 10 years ago, or for that matter, the other two earlier kind of reflection processes, the one in 67 under Harmel and the one in 56, the so-called Wiseman report. Ours was different in two ways. First, our brief was more narrow. we were given a specific task, and that is shore up, give recommendations for how to bolster and shore up NATO politically. Doesn't mean we didn't take notice of the military factors, but it was a political tasker. And secondly, I think just the context of what we were doing, the global power transition that's underway, just the global nature of the conversation we're having about international security with multiple regions now, the developments in multiple regions having an impact on Euro-Atlantic security, the fact of China's rise out of area, et cetera, et cetera. I think this was the first reflection process of its kind in NATO that really could not give recommendations in Euro-Atlantic area without having a global map and aperture. And then second comment is how important it was in our work that we produce something, the recommendations of the report be produced in a way that were politically and practically plausible. And as Thomas said, that really sets us apart from a think tank exercise. We heard a lot of good ideas in the process, but the sort of winnowing function here was to ask ourselves, is the idea in question, whatever it is, something that has a plausible prospect of gaining support from all 30 allies? I think that's really important when you read the report, because we designed it to be something that could gain traction. And the final thing I'll say on that, maybe to address your question about the political dimension, Ian, I think as is often the case in U.S.-Europe relations, and for all of us, we're Atlanticists at heart, so we follow these matters. I think every generation tends to get caught up in the topics du jour, the latest newspaper article or poll, or in our time, that might be the latest tweet. And clearly that mattered. I mean, it was a comment from President Macron that helped prompt the process, his concerns about the political cohesion of NATO. Europeans can point to statements that President Trump and others have made that were of concern to them. But a key thing I want to stress is really to put those things in proper perspective. Our group attempted to grapple with a longer term 10-year frame that really, when you take that time frame, you have to focus on deeper structural changes that are underway that supersede these political currents. And I think if you read the report in that light, as a document that's looking at the world of 10 years from now and reasoning backwards to what we need to do now, whether it's functionally in the design of NATO and the processes of NATO, how we set priorities, that's really the right way to read the report and to understand what we were trying to accomplish.
Wes, thank you very much. Marta, let me turn to you now and do share some reflections for us, but maybe also say a little bit, about, I take the point from both of you that I've heard already that it was in some ways a very congenial, very easy exercise to do in that interpersonal sense, but politically a lot of navigation clearly. But were there things that were hard to do, things that were hard to talk about, things where you could have said more, but this wasn't going to work? Marta, over to you.
First of all, this is an unfair question. I'm guessing. In the end, we succeeded in producing this long report, already very well described by our two co-chairs, Thomas and Wess. They were very firm in this consensus building exercise. You rightly say that there was not a consensus by definition since the very beginning, because the group was set up precisely to let possible divisions emerge from a geographical point of view, from a functional point of view. So the real test, if you wish, of the entire exercise was to find a good balance on very tricky issues. And the way in which our two co-chairs decided to try this fine-tuning was to put together twins of writers. It was, from this point of view, the mechanism of writing is an interesting one. The report was not written by one single person, and it was not written by others. It was written by us, but it was written in subgroups. putting together, if you wish, the opposites. And so the idea from Thomas in particular, but also Wess, was that if you are able to find a consensus within this kind of couple of writers, then a more general consensus is possible. And that was true. And so the critical issues were, in a sense, what to do next with Russia, because we had within our group different people, Anna Fotyga from Poland, Hubert Védrine from France. Then clearly there is a difficult position to take on questions pertaining to Turkey, for instance. And again, we have the position of France, but we have also different positions on that front. But I mean, this consensus building exercise was an interesting one to be part of. And it was, in my view, a successful one. The report is not an out-of-the-box report of think tanks. It's already, if you wish, the result of a political compromise. And from that point of view, it put on the table a set of considerations, a set of practical proposals that are possible to be implemented. So the real point was, let's try to make and to suggest something feasible. And if you look to the Food for Thought paper presented by the Secretary General right ahead of the Ministerial of the Defense Ministries last February, an important part of these proposals were already received by Stoltenberg himself. Over to you, Ian.
Marta, thank you very much. You know, maybe I could just come back to all three of you actually on this question of where you felt, maybe to put it a different way, that you could have said more. Perhaps it didn't make sense to say more, but you could have said more if the political situation, perhaps the political climate around the report were a little bit different. I mean, we'll get there in the sidebar already. We have a number of questions that have come in, a lot of them about differences of view between the United States and Europe, but I wasn't so much thinking about that. I was thinking, if you were to do this exercise again, and maybe there will be a rerun of it in relation to the strategic concept, we'll talk about that in a minute. Where could you have done more, said more usefully? Thomas.
Well, first of all, Marta was very frank by explaining the process. It's true, of course, but it was a reason behind it, because she said it rightly. And we heard totally different opinions when we had consultations. We've had consultation with all the countries, with nearly all the partner countries, a lot of experts. And if I concentrate on the countries, on the allies, some said, you have to think out of the box. This is very, very important. For example, consensus is a difficult instrument for getting progress. Other allies said, well, first of all, don't touch consensus. This is the key of everything. And we are well underway, and please don't think too much out of the box. So, our report is not to make ourselves happy, but to have a reasonable and practical path for progress for the alliance. And just to give an example where we had a lot of discussion. One is China. Perhaps Wess can explain it better than me, how we tried to recommend to deal with China. I will put it. I will explain it on the example of consultation mechanism and consensus. We said, yes, consensus is the key of everything, especially when it comes to Article 5. No doubt about it. But consensus cannot be an instrument to block everything. So how to deal with these two opinions? So we tried, for example, to say to make a blockage within NATO should only be possible for ministers on the ministerial level. So this is a compromise between doing nothing and destroying the principle of consensus. And and to widen up the discussions, including the private sector, to invite other ministers, finance, interior, research, trade, to include national security advisors, things like that. They're only examples that the political debate culture, the culture of debates, must be changed. And we and via recommending these instruments, we describe a process. Some of us in the group could have imagined more, some less, but these examples describe a way how to make NATO more alive. And same on especially China and new technologies. Perhaps on China, I don't know if you allow that Wess could explain that.
Wess, let me turn to you. I mean, where could you have done more, or what was tough to do? And perhaps to pick up this question that Thomas has left us with about China.
Yeah. Well, look, let me put it this way. To my mind, if there's one really big message from this report that stands out above all else, and probably what it will be remembered for 20, 30 years from now, the one big message is the world is transitioning to an era of more intense geopolitical rivalries. What Europeans call systemic rivalries, Americans call great power competition. And the message of the report is that's an empirical reality. There's a material dimension to that. There's a political and ideological dimension to that. But that in any event, NATO needs to wake up to that. My own opinion is in some ways, NATO is late in waking up to it. I think Stoltenberg's done a great job of evolving the alliance the last few years. But these are momentous and fast-moving changes that are underway in the balance of power. China is a truly comprehensive, full-spectrum peer competitor to the United States. Russia is a persistent and vengeful player. And so the report says, look, we have to evolve NATO to reflect that reality. The reason that's such an important message is that NATO is coming out of a 30-year period during which we didn't have to worry about a peer competitor. And we largely focused, we had the luxury of assuming the lack of a peer competitor and the discipline that imposes on our strategies. We had the luxury also of assuming a relatively open-ended kind of resource abundant environment, meaning financially, economically, the United States, European countries, you know, in the 1990s, we were looking at a world in which we assumed the ability to do things that were now constrained in certain ways, externally and internally. So if you grasp or you absorb sort of that central message, and then I look at your question, what could have been said more, I would have two comments. The first is, if that's the main theme of the report, in some ways, and I'm speaking for myself kind of after the fact rather than for the entire group, we probably could have said less on a few things. I think the balance came out right, and clearly some parts of the report we needed to address issues that are important to certain publics in NATO. I think that's appropriate. But given the scale of what's underway in the world, a big message of the report is we have to prioritize and get serious about strategy. And so, you know, we spend a lot of time in the report on some things that are not central to the NATO job jar. Pandemics, I would argue climate change. Now we handle those, I think, appropriately, because we try to point out in those sections where the competencies of NATO start and stop versus other international organizations or nation states. But I think there are some areas where we probably could have said a little less. And then secondly, if we had wanted to really say more, and I think this would point to work for think tanks in the future, you know, the really deep dive or the deeper conversation needs to be had. I don't think the report was the proper place for this, but the discussion in light of this transition to a new era geopolitically, I think, is how do we get the balance right? How do we, as Thomas said, what is the grand bargain between the United States and Europe? And what is the balance of benefits and burdens that allows the United States, inevitably, we will focus more and more attention on Asia Pacific. And that should not be done in a way that undermines stability in Europe. And so I think there's a higher math conversation about how these changing power dynamics in multiple regions, how that adds up, what role can NATO play in ensuring the ability, well, our report calls it strategic simultaneity, right? The ability to manage a problem set that is a lot bigger and more complex than it was arguably during the Cold War. So that would be my answer. But again, I think that was beyond the remit of the report to get deeper into the broader conversation. I think we had a much more managed and narrow remit in terms of strengthening NATO politically. But I think inevitably that's where the conversation needs to move over time.
Wes, thanks very much. Marta, if you have any other thoughts on this, but also maybe to say a word, and I already see a couple of questions related to this in the Q&A box. You know, the way in which the exercise dealt with sort of challenges looking south, you know, there are a lot of likely contingencies. They may not all be existential, but, you know, in the context of the report, it was a relatively small part of the findings. But maybe to talk to that, maybe with your Italian hat, a little bit from that perspective.
Yeah, sure. If I can go back a moment to the general setting, I think that on NATO now, there are more or less two schools of thinking on the future of NATO. One says more or less NATO in the end was able to find an enemy back, since 2014 has been able to adapt very swiftly from a military point of view. So let's add something, the new dimension of threats, the cyber dimension, the technology dimension, but more or less, let's stay focused on deterrence and defense in the Euro-Atlantic region. That is what NATO does best. And so this is one of the ways in which you can look at the future of NATO. The other one is the school that could be defined as the global adaptation drive. Global adaptation from a geographical point of view, Wess rightly underlined the weight of the China threat at this point, and from a functional point of view. Let's add all these transnational risks, climate change, et cetera, more or less leading to resilience as a new area of intervention for NATO. The report is part of the second school of thinking. Clearly, we are in favor of a global adaptation of NATO. So from this point of view, our position, in my view, is very clear. Then clearly, the mandate was a limited one, because the mandate was the following one: how can we make NATO stronger from a political point of view? So you cannot read the report if you look reprised to the big questions concerning military strategy, for instance. It's all about the political strategy and the way in which you can reinforce cohesion within NATO. And this is why we give such a prominence to the institutional issue, if you wish, decision-making, organization of discussions, et cetera, et cetera. On the southern front, I would say yes, in a sense it was less present in our discussion as compared to the theme Wess was alluding to, the return to global power competition, Russia and China in particular. And yet it was very clear to us, at least, that you cannot separate any longer the two fronts. Because what you have in the global south, to put it this way, is the new relevance of Russia, for instance, in Libya, in Syria, and the like. So in a sense, you have a neighboring region from east to south, where NATO has to act more efficiently. One reason why the part on the south is apparently streamlined to the extreme is that out of a German vision of rationality, parts of this chapter were allocated elsewhere. For instance, if you discuss about the Mediterranean issues, you have to deal with the reason why the current partnership are not so effective. The Mediterranean dialogue, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, but you will find these partnerships in the chapter on partnerships. Then you have terrorism and terrorism is again a chapter in itself. You have energy security, and this is again a chapter in itself. So, I mean, you will find the South here and there and there, and the result is that the part on the Mediterranean per se is a bit poor, in my view. I agree with you. And I think, and I close here, I think that one of the main problems for NATO in the future will be not only to define a strategy vis-a-vis China, which is a key point, to avoid decoupling, in a sense, between the US and Europe, but also to define a strategy for the Middle East and for the Mediterranean. And only when, in my view, we have defined a strategy, a new strategy for the Mediterranean and the Middle East, we will be also able to deal more efficiently with the kind of problems Turkey is now posing to the Atlantic Alliance.
Marta, thanks. Thomas, Wess, maybe I could come back to you with a question sort of looking ahead. And I want to save some time to open it to all of our participants as well. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you about, to the extent that you can comment on it, what you see coming in terms of the strategic concept, both in terms of process, but also in terms of, the sort of continuity from this exercise into the strategic concept mandate, and where you think that sort of might be going. So please.
Well, there was a discussion around the world to update the strategic concept or to make a new one. And well, the difference is not so big, but in the end, we recommended to update the strategy. What was the reason for that? The reason was that, for good reasons, a new strategic concept would be better in a way, for the reasons Wess explained: China, new posture of Russia, new technologies, and things like that. But we wanted to keep the three core tasks: collective defense, collective security, and so on. So if you start to discuss everything, then perhaps you could end by discussing, well, the importance of Article 5, and we wanted to avoid that. So the three core tasks should be kept as a keystone. Perhaps, and this is in the report, perhaps we need a fourth core task, and this is resilience. Marta mentioned it, and in our group, Marta was from the beginning on the first fighter for the importance of resilience. This could be perhaps a core task, but don't touch Article 5. So this was the reason why we recommended to update the strategy. The difference is probably not so big. And then the second point, and we are very happy that Stoltenberg took this as well. No long discussions about the strategic concept. You could easily discuss 5 years. Well, what about new technologies? Let's wait and see and ask other experts. And the development of China could be very much evaluated for years and years. You say this should not be a too long discussion. The discussion about the new or updated strategic concept should not be an excuse to start with a lot of changements, to look at new technologies, to have a new start for the NATO-EU relations and things. So this strategic concept is important. It's a basis for the military documents. It's late to do so, but 1 year or 1.5 should be enough. So this is the background of this these discussions.
Thank you. Wess,
yeah.
How do you see it?
I would agree with that. I think it's well said. I would just add, it's important to bear in mind that the strategic concept we have now was built in a world that is now gone. The world of 2010. For all the reasons I articulated earlier, I think the countries of NATO could reasonably take certain things for granted in the broader power setting that they can't now. And so that, the focus, for example, on out of area operations that is implied inevitably the mentality of kind of crisis management or reaction, which I think is a legacy of the immediate post-Cold War period as well. And so I agree with Thomas that I think what needs to be done is the updating of this document to reflect the strategic realities we have now. And in doing that, I think it's the same as essentially in any large institution. You have to balance the principles of conservation and correction. Conservation, I think there's a lot about the existing strategic concept to keep and cherish. And so the three core tasks strike me as still being very serviceable. We heard that consistently from NATO capitals. Where correction is needed, I think, first and foremost, is obviously to acknowledge the new strategic environment, and then, see that the existing framework is inadequate in certain ways. And I would say, perhaps a fourth core task. Thomas mentioned resilience. To my mind, countering instability would be a logical one because it comprehends a lot of the challenges that I think we'll face in a great power competitive environment. It overlaps a good deal with resilience. But I think fundamentally what Thomas and I are both saying is you're grafting on prudential changes to a good foundation. But make no mistake that the upgrade is urgently needed. And I think the net effect of it should be to create a clearer sense of priorities in NATO. It may have been in the 90s and 2000s that we could talk about a kind of 360-degree two azimuths approach, but I think we need clarity in priorities. A strategic document that doesn't provide priorities, I think, is of very low value. So I would resist the temptation in that document to try to pour everything into the NATO job jar. I would resist the temptation in some quarters to make NATO's political role be global in the sense of trying to be a kind of helpmate to the United Nations worldwide. I think staying focused on the Euro-Atlantic area is key. And the final thing I'll say, it gives me some confidence and optimism that NATO at present has excellent military strategies in place that I think anticipate the world that we're describing, and the consensus around those, informal consensus, may provide a reasonable basis to build on in updating the strategic concept.
Marta,
Ian, just to reveal another secret, like Marta, the group itself probably would have preferred to recommend a new strategic concept. But during our consultations, perhaps Wess or Marta, a third or so of the allies said, don't touch the strategic concept at all because it's too risky. We know it's old, but the discussion is a risk in itself. And so in a way, to take them into the boat, we proposed to update the strategic concept, and the result is quite good.
Yeah, it was interesting from a certain point of view because we were named more or less in April. We went on until November. In the meantime, if I may say so, the idea that we need an updated strategic concept has gradually become more obvious. At the very beginning, it was not. So it was a learning by doing process, if I may. I very much agree with Thomas and Wess in particular. The real problem is adaptation. This is the key word we use in the report. This is part of the legacy. Trying to enlarge, in a sense, as I was mentioning before, the functions NATO is now performing without losing this focus, which is a regional-oriented focus, the North Atlantic region, and with this emphasis on the three core missions. But then the real problem you have, in my view, is being able to deal with China. And here, clearly, the report from this point of view is a big opening move. We need to deal with that issue. My view is that in the future 10 years, the vitality or the difficulties of the transatlantic relationship will be measured most of all on that, because clearly for the United States, be it Trump or Biden, it doesn't make any difference. China is clearly the problem number one, the competitor for global hegemony, the technological rival, etc., etc. For the Europeans also, they are becoming to see the problem in this light, a systemic rival, we said, and yet it's very hard to supersede, if you wish, an economy first logic in our dealings with China. And from the European point of view, the hesitation is that, okay, if a new high-tech Cold War of some sort is going to open up between China and the United States, we do not want to be drawn into it. So it's a difficult balancing act, in my view. And we have to specify a bit better, which is the kind of position NATO could take on this front. Technology control, for instance, reducing of vulnerabilities in the supply chains, problems concerning the new scarce resources, rare health, etc., 5G, all these kind of issues. And so, in my view, dealing with China means how are we going to deal with China within the NATO frame? This is a fascinating topic, in my view, and a very critical one for the new strategic concept.
Thanks to all of you. We have a lot of questions that have come in. I will confess there's no way we're going to get even a fraction of them, but I've taken the liberty of sort of grouping some of them together because there were some key themes. A lot of them were about China. We've already talked a lot about China, but I'm conscious of our time. And there were quite a number about the EU-NATO cooperation, the question of strategic autonomy. To what extent did this play in your deliberations? And here I realize I may be taking you out of the report findings per se, but just any of your own comments would be welcome, quite briefly. I open it up to any of you. Thomas,
Wes, will you start this time? Yeah,
Sure.
go ahead.
No, I'm happy to take a crack at that.
Go ahead.
So the short answer is that it figured quite a lot. And I will make a personal observation that to my mind, in all the issues that we looked at, if I had to say the one that honestly poses the biggest challenges for political cohesion in NATO over the next 10 years, it's the question of the evolving role of the European Union and how that entity interacts with NATO. I think other things pale in comparison, being either political or temporary in nature. Even the tempests in day-to-day political conversations that grab the headlines, I think different leaders come and go on both sides of the Atlantic. But this is a structural issue that I think is persistent and has been evolving for some time. And especially post-Brexit, I think Brexit will have the ripple effect of clarifying and focusing a lot of the debate inside the EU on what kind of strategic actor it's going to be. And I don't sense that there is a consensus among the countries of NATO who are members of the EU on what they want that relationship to be. In our group, I would say there were 2, occasionally 3 members of the group who favored a much more front-footed, let's put it this way, vision in the report for a relationship between NATO and the EU, whereby NATO would concede certain areas on either a functional or regional basis to the European Union as a security actor. I think by and large, if there was a consensus in the group, though, it tended in a more conservative and status quo direction. I didn't see, for example, evidence that Europeans themselves necessarily have an agreed definition of strategic autonomy. Variously in the project, in the reflection group deliberations or conversations with European capitals, strategic autonomy would sometimes be talked about as a strictly technological aspiration, for example. Sometimes it would be talked about in a much more general sense of aspiring to be a kind of pole or actor in the world. But on a day-to-day basis, if I were to look at the input that we got from consultations with NATO capitals, I would say on a day-to-day basis, and I realize I'm saying this as an American, but I think there are a number of states inside the NATO alliance that see this dynamic. The tendency of a subset of EU members of NATO to want to preserve to themselves certain competencies, either that already are beginning to be part of the EU's repertoire, or that could conceivably someday be in the repertoire of the EU. So that predilection for withholding consensus for action at NATO on things that the EU may someday want to be the main actor on is a real issue. I think it's affecting us big time right now. I'll just single out one area, and that is something that Marta mentioned, and it is technology. So the ability to even have a meaningful conversation in NATO, much less have NATO play a role as organizing and galvanizing platform for its members to pool R&D in emerging and disruptive technologies, deal with emerging challenges in EDT on interoperability or capabilities. The biggest obstacle to that is the fact of EU regulations. Now, that's not a criticism, it's just a reflection of the fact that for NATO to function well, it has to have a productive relationship with the European Union. And in many areas, I think that relationship is over-prescribed in formal and institutional terms, meaning there's no shortage of formal agreements and public statements of the last 20 years saying that the two entities will work together. But it's actually very underdeveloped in day-to-day collaboration on the things that matter most. And so I think that's one of the biggest areas of focus for NATO in coming years, if not the biggest.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, please.
Yes, Wess is a very polite person, so I, as a European, can put it a bit clearer and more open. I think looking to this relation, we had in our group a common feeling of disappointment, especially from the European side. The lag between wording and doing is immense. If you look behind the curtains, what's going on the EU security discussions and level, it's just disappointing. There are not really priorities. There is not really a day-to-day business between NATO and the EU. It's just not the case. There is progress. Stoltenberg was invited to the European Summit, EU Summit last month. This was good. And there are starting discussions. But what we recommend there is a big summit between NATO and the EU, or something like that. Perhaps it's not a formal summit because of the Cyprus question and Turkey and Greece, but to look in your eyes and say what do we really want to do together, and stop these loud wording without substance. Let me just give you one example: strategic autonomy. Well, what does that really mean? And now I share with you my personal opinion. Strategic autonomy means that you don't have common rules beside the European Union, that the European Union can do everything alone. And this is not the case, and it should not be a vision. It could be an invitation for America to leave Europe, and Europe will never ever be capable to have a nuclear deterrence, a European nuclear deterrence. France will not to do so. Great Britain is not member of the European Union. It's not too ambitious. It's just not the right description what's going on. What you mean, and this is important, more responsibility on the European side. This is clear, but there's a lot to do to go in this direction. And I can tell you stories I will not do in this forum. But if you talk about Eurofighter, it's not a European airplane. It's just a common framework, and then you have national planes in a way. So this is not not a common European effort. So this is what we recommend, to do more, tell less, and do more together, not on summits, but on the day-to-day basis. For example, a division of labor towards Africa, for example, would be of great progress. Just to look where is NATO better received, where not, and things like that. Perhaps EU is a bit better in well, crisis management. NATO is a bit better in robust missions. How can you put these two abilities together in Africa? So strategic discussions about that. All these examples can be made. So this is our recommendation: a restart and to do more. Really, to do more and neglect these naive visions. This was a personal point of view.
Absolutely. Marta, another thought on this, and I'm conscious of our time. One more question I want to try to get in.
More or less, I agree. I think that if you wish, speaking again as myself, as we all are doing here, strategic autonomy in the defense sector strictly has no sense, in my view. Clearly, to defend Europe, you continue to need a nuclear guarantee, first of all, by the United States, and more generally, we are part of NATO as I was set up. And the French vision of strategic autonomy is not, after all, so popular in Europe. If you talk to Germans or Italians for this purpose, they have a much more clear view of the needed complementarity between more capabilities of Europe on the one hand and the preservation and the reinforcing of NATO. And to give you a hint about the new Italian government, Draghi was very clear on this point. There has been very recently a discussion on strategic autonomy at the European Council, and Draghi together with Angela Merkel were on the same page on that. Complementarity is the key word. So I would say that on strategic autonomy, and I would add that reinforcing Europe from a military point of view, more capabilities, is very important also to reinforce NATO. We stayed with a long debate on the burden sharing. We need to have to translate money into military capabilities.
Marta, thank you. And thank you for mentioning burden sharing, because a number of the questions actually touched on that. There was one in particular that went beyond that to talk about the question of common financing. So the question was, why did you not, or did you perhaps consider saying more about common financing, but decided in the end against it? Secretary General mentioned it recently.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that? Marta, go ahead, if you like.
Yeah. The Secretary General mentioned that, and very clearly, it is true that a minor fraction of our military budgets go to common funding, and yet this is not a point we in particular discussed during our proceedings, Thomas, isn't it?
It's true, yes. But we recommended to increase the budget for the political role of NATO. And this is common funding, of course. That's true. It was underestimated in the past. If you would like to strengthen the political role, then you need more money. Just to give an example, the budget for partnerships is, I think, I don't know, 20, 25 million or so. A year, and we want that the partnerships we have as NATO should be from strategic importance, especially in the Pacific area and some areas in the South. And there you need money, for example. If they are interest driven from our side, then you need more money. So this is our discussion. We didn't touch, because it was not part of our mandate, the role of common financing of military missions.
Okay. Wess, let me turn to you, if I could, for a final thought on this or anything else you'd like to
Sure. Well, you know, as always, Thomas and Marta, I think have been very thorough. I guess I would just add, maybe from obviously a U.S. perspective and a longer term sort of strategic perspective. Again, bringing it back to kind of the key development of our time, which is this change in international geopolitics. I would just say, you know, it's important to look at how Europe organizes itself as a security actor through the lens of what that global division, that balance of power is going to look like. And I'm now speaking not ex cathedra, but sort of just generally. I can't emphasize enough to European audiences how much the U.S. will, in coming years, be preoccupied with the security of the Indo-Pacific region and developments there. China economically is the first power in our country's modern history that has the near-term potential to outclass the United States in all dimensions of power. It's larger demographically, larger economy, and is currently on track to have a larger and more powerful military than the United States within the next decade. And I say that not to be gloomy, but to say I think, unlike in the past when think tanks would talk about the European Union or debate some of these things, in a relatively static strategic environment, that strategic environment is no longer static. And so I think you will see the United States, given our debt loads, I think in our internal social cohesion issues, I think perforce the United States will be more inward facing in coming generations. I would note, again, just gaining altitude, all three of the last three administrations, Obama, Trump, and Biden, have campaigned on essentially some version of domestic rejuvenation. So Obama's nation building at home, Trump's America First, and Biden's Build Back Better. That's a reflection of our social issues and cohesion, the infrastructure, the state of the debt, et cetera. Externally, then, if you factor in a rising China and the United States putting what in real terms will be less and less spending on defense, will focus more and more on Asia. I would look at the discussion about NATO and the EU in that vein. I agree with Thomas. It's in all of our interests, not just as Atlanticists, but I think our societies, to not see the United States strategically decouple from Europe. In fact, I would argue the opposite, that the chief task of our time is the strategic and political consolidation of the West. And so the scenarios that present themselves are either that the European Union takes on the trappings of a security actor to provide for its own interests and neighborhood, and preferably that be done in a way that deconflicts as much as possible with the United States, or that within NATO, and this is again me speaking in the future tense and personally, privately, I think the idea, for example, of a European level of ambition inside NATO, something that Thomas was fond of, and I have to say I'm attracted to as well. We didn't put it in the report, but something that acknowledges the practical need for more pooling of efforts among the Europeans to meet their capability targets in NATO. But either way, what it all points towards eventually is the need for more of a global division of labor, whereby Europeans, whether through the vehicle of the EU or NATO or both, are taking greater responsibilities for dealing with Russia. And the United States is taking on greater responsibilities for dealing with Asia, but preferably that all of that be done in a way that strengthens NATO and politically and keeps us in these 70-year-old structures and engaging with one another as much as possible.
Marta, Wess, Thomas, thank you very much indeed. This has really been an extraordinary conversation. Thank you very much for sharing some of these insights. We talked about the theme we set out, but we also talked about a lot of other things, and we even managed to get to some of the 40 or so questions that came in, one way or the other. So my thanks to the audience for joining us. We certainly will be doing programming, more of it, around these issues in the months to come. But again, our thanks to you. If you have friends who missed this, they can watch it on GMF's YouTube channel. But again, let me wish you all goodbye from Brussels. Thanks so much.